In the past few years, the combination of Metroidvania and Souls-like has become fairly common among indie devs with titles like Blasphemous, Hollow Knight, Salt and Sanctuary, and beyond. So today we want to figure out, does the Tarnishing of Juxtia live up to the quality of its contemporaries, or will it fade into the void like so many others? Starting with the story, we have the general and somewhat predictable ground that is a destroyed kingdom, long abandoned after a war and a plague, where we have been reanimated by some mystical force to do their bidding and oppose the corruption that has spread. This includes finding the few still sane and intact allies, as well as fighting off the corrupted husks of those they held dear or in high regard. As you travel, you will unravel more information about each of these characters, gain more knowledge and abilities, as well as unlock new paths, sometimes branching, sometimes not. There's very little lore in this world, as is the usual method of these games due to both of their genres kind of neglecting that aspect, but you do get enough dialogue as you travel, both from your mystical patron, as well as both friend and foe along your way, to at least get a basic understanding of what happened and is happening in this dying world. All of this should be pretty familiar to anyone who has played the games mentioned at the beginning of the video. For me, it's neither here nor there, but I do feel that this game has done a bit better job at portraying the information about the world than some of its contemporaries, even if the actual story is fairly cliche. It is still enough to drive you forward and get you to an understanding of the power dynamics and give you an idea of where the story and twists are going in the future. Though, as with most games in this genre, the story is not generally what's going to make or break the title, unless they reach a point of epic success or epic failure. So it's a case of good enough will do, and good enough is had. Instead, the Souls-like Metroidvania kind of lives and dies on its gameplay and maps, just like its parent genres. So let's hit that gameplay first. If you want a quick parallel, Blasphemous is going to be your strongest contemporary example, with slower, more methodical, and proper Souls-like combat that favors knowing the length of your attack animations, dodge roll invincibility, and reading enemy tells, as well as more flat-footed platforming rather than the high-flying platforming of something like Hollow Knight. Though for me, Tarnishing of Juxtia pretty much achieves what it set out to do in this regard, almost to a fault, since your animations cannot cancel each other, so you have to be extremely methodical and always be aware of what's going on around you. This is something very few games actually do, so it can take some adjusting if you're used to more responsive, twitchy combat. More than once, even with some of the faster weapons, I did find myself doing single swings followed by dodge rolls, since that's all I had time to do between enemy attacks, especially on the faster melee bosses. With the heavier weapons, such as the Great Sword or Hammer, which have your overhead attack method, I found them almost insufferable against some bosses since there were almost no windows for performing your attack, while the extremely fast weapons like the fists or the daggers were a lot shorter range, so you had to place yourself in the danger zone much more often and be even more on point with your dodge rolls since you had much less wiggle room on space. That said, those more confident with the swinging timings will find the heavier weapons better, and those who are better at dodging will get a lot more DPS from the smaller fast weapons. But you can tell that the basic sword is going to be the weapon most average players will tend to gravitate to, despite its lack of overhead swings. The other big aspect of weapons to keep an eye on is their frenzy effect. Once you hit a certain number of charges from attacking enemies, you'll get a solid stamina and mana recovery for a few seconds. The number of charges from each weapon varies, but it's generally pretty close to a full attack sequence for the given weapon. I didn't find myself paying too much attention to this since it's fairly easy to achieve, but it is an important tool for certain setups to keep your resources capped off against tougher enemies. I feel the press material kind of overstates its value though, since even at the high end, it's not make or break for combat to kind of like worry about it. Now, in terms of defense, the dodge roll is super important, and there are different flavors of it you can get through pieces of equipment ranging from backdash that is familiar to Symphony of the Night players, to a faster front dash or even the default front roll, each of which has different stamina requirements, frame speeds, etc. That said, there are a few other options that can help you out defensively. The most basic is just the fact that your armor can provide bonuses to resistances, and even just provide damage reduction as well as boosts or penalties to your various stats like life, mana, stamina, etc. There's even a few armors with interesting special effects that, when they're completed as a set, are generally pretty nice, but they're less valuable until that point, so do keep an eye on side paths to complete those, but it's not entirely necessary to do them to beat the game. The last big defensive set of tools are abilities. You get a shield spell relatively early on, as well as a shield boss ability too. These are a bit fiddly to explain, but basically spells consume mana, while the boss abilities consume a special resource unique to each of them, and generally they have the most impactful function compared to skills. Doing everything from an area of effect stomp to summoning a wraith with a sword, and yes, even a shield ability that can parry foes in a similar manner to the shield spell. As you can tell by some of those descriptions, these also have their own offensive uses too, and spells in particular are going to be your real source of ranged attacks for baiting or damaging more dangerous enemies to soften them up before the fight. That said, you can go full brawler and just have fun ignoring these abilities, but they are still nice to keep in mind for a pinch. Now, in most Metroidvanias, that would be the majority of what you deal with, but in Juxtia, it also has its own take on the charm systems from other games, with miscellaneous items you find throughout the game that have a sort of pro and con effect. One of the earliest ones being an item that improves your durability at the cost of losing mana regeneration, but there's also plenty of other abilities, with one of my favorites being an item that reduces your healing items down to 3, but allows you to replenish them through dealing damage, which is a feature I loved in Hellpoint as well. Though if you do pass up on that specific item, you still have plenty of upgrades throughout the game to help you with it, as there is a spider character that will give you additional healing slots every time you find them, basically giving you more Estus flasks in exchange for exploration, which is really nice, not to mention just the perks of leveling up in general can make you much more durable. Speaking of which, you do have a stat system which is pretty much exactly like a Dark Souls stat system, and it's pretty nice, especially since you can grind it up a little bit if you're struggling. Though, like with Dark Souls style games, it will only get you so far, since getting past a certain point, especially with early grinding, can get tedious due to escalating level costs. Personally, I found I tended to favor dexterity, stamina, and life for my playthrough, since it fit my style the most, but boosting your magic is perfectly viable for those who like to play casters, and boosting strength for a bruiser is a possibility too, but bruiser feels like it may be the hardest path of the bunch due to just being pure strength weapons. It's kinda slow moving, but they hit hard. The other things you can do to improve your chances are upgrade your weapons with farmable shards, though they do take a while to farm, and I got most of mine from exploring instead, but a few enemies can drop them, as well as remember to explore every nook and cranny, since that's where you'll find most of your interesting key items. Though don't worry too much about hidden passages, as they're not exceptionally common in the game, but rather just follow the map to get the most out of it. On the subject of maps though, I do wish it had a little more detail, though I can understand why it doesn't, and that's mainly to get you to keep exploring, while still giving you a good idea of where you've been. Though if they could add a thing to indicate what you've missed, like things in Quietus did, I would love it, or maybe more detail like Hollow Knight, but as it is, it's still competitive with the rest of the genre, so I can't really hold it against it, since it's functional, it's just not an impediment either. In the actual zones, the design feels a lot more Metroidvania-ish than the actual game is. In fact, there's a lot of linear aspects to the title. Though a scripted to death did kind of catch me off guard in regards to that, since it almost felt like it was going to lock me off of previous areas, but thankfully it didn't. There was an elevator nearby. I think one of the things I liked a lot about the map design in this though is that sure, there's easy and hard points, but pretty much every difficult zone had a healing checkpoint before it and after it, so a lot of retreading wasn't a terrible experience and wasn't really necessary. The walk of shame was relatively short. This was made a little more interesting in that there's actually two types of these checkpoints. The small wells just respawning enemies and replenishing your resources, while only the big wells were able to let you change abilities, which helped with the pacing quite a bit, compared to if you had just all big wells, since it kept the tension up just enough without it being overwhelming. Now, I have been mostly praising the title so far, and giving information about what it does okay or good, but there are a few little complaints I had during my time with it, and while none of them were deal breakers for me, I could see them getting frustrating to certain people. Starting with boss design, it really feels like a coin flip as to how difficult a boss will be. It's not so much their damage, but rather their attack patterns. Some bosses have really solid tells, and their hitboxes are absolutely on point, and it feels like solving a puzzle to beat them. While a handful of bosses felt a bit more chaotic, with overlapping sprites making reading them hard, or some of their damage frames and hitboxes feeling slightly off, and one even reminding me of the Traitor Mantis from Hollow Knight after they changed his patterns to be more chaotic, and in turn, more frustrating than his more logical pattern that favored attacks based on your position. And the boss in question is sadly the first real boss of the game too, which will bite some people in the butt, especially since it's really hard to tell if he's going to do a 1 attack, 2 attack, or even 3 attack pattern, with his second phase even being faster and more chaotic, and almost a reskinned mirror of the actual Traitor Mantis fight itself. And yes, most bosses do actually have a pissy boss mode as their second phase, though it does still follow a similar pattern to their original attacks. The other big grump, other than some small gripes like the forced death we mentioned earlier, was that I actually missed out on an ability and some dialogue, since the end of a fight with a boss, you get locked in place for the resolution event that gives you a skill. But in the case of one boss, he had summoned ads that killed me while I was stuck in place for that, so I didn't get the ability, and when I went back, he was nowhere to be found, so I just flat out didn't have his ability for the rest of the game. That said, these are both able to be overcome fairly easily, with the first one being slightly more difficult, since it means looking at some of the bosses and enemy patterns on hit timings and maybe tightening them up, which is generally a feel thing to begin with, so it won't be perfect for everyone regardless of what you do. And the other one, you would just implement a simple fix of just making the ads in a boss arena just despawn upon death. So these could both be different on release or soon after. The other thing that they might need to fix is the audio, which I don't think most people will notice, since most people don't have their audio set to weird levels like I do while streaming. But basically, there were some audio glitches while playing where it would sometimes forget I had volume low for about 1/10 of a second and then return to normal. But I can't hold that against them too much, since outside of the glitch, the music kicks butt, the sound effects are really solid, so overall enjoyable, and I doubt most people will encounter the same issue I had, because it's kind of a weird French case. That happens with a lot of titles. In the end though, we have a question to answer here. Does Tarnishing of Juxtia live up to the quality of its contemporaries? And for me, I would say yes, though I should note, it for the most part feels like it just meets them. It doesn't go above and beyond them. So if you enjoyed games like Blasphemous, this will be an enjoyable, more of that please type game. But it's not going to sell you on the genre if you didn't enjoy similar titles. So this sadly means it will probably fade into the background and possibly obscurity, but it will still be a reasonably fun experience to have if you enjoy the genre. And as always, if you enjoyed this review and want to see me touch on another game, new or old, mention it down below. And I'd like to give a special thanks to all the channel supporters that help keep the lights on. Every little bit helps a ton.